It's a fairly intimate affair, I would say. Um, Second day after lunch. Hopefully, we can energize a little bit more, but I think let's wait a couple more minutes. So we'll aim to start at 2:10 on the dot. And I think maybe if we could get people to move up front a little bit, and then we can have a much more enriching, direct conversation. Just to alert, and I think just for everyone, yeah, we've got media in the room today. So we've got representative from Makaranga as observer, but just I think to just be aware, I think is important to highlight that. Thank you. Okay. Welcome everybody to this breakout session on sustainable forestry. My name is Pep George. I will be your moderator today. I'm the Asia Pacific Biodiversity Lead for PwC Malaysia. Relatively new in that role, but I've been in the sector for 20 years plus, previously in forestry and then in palm. So hopefully we can provide, I think, a little bit of a nice conversation today with regards to how sustainable forestry can move the needle in the climate change agenda. So today it's a fairly small, intimate room, which I think is good for us and good for discussion. So just to run you through how we're going to do this today. So we'll start off with 10-minute sort of briefing from each of the participants, distinguished panel members up on the screen there. Sorry, it's afternoon. So they'll each be presenting for 10 minutes. And then after everybody's done, we'll come together for a panel discussion. So because it is a small room, I know there is Slido, but I think it would be maybe much more appreciative if we could have more of a kind of informal discussion here today. And so, welcome everybody to just have a chat with us. And so it is my pleasure to introduce this panel of distinguished guests. From left to right, Alan Lian, who is the responsible forestry manager for World Wildlife Fund Malaysia, WWF Malaysia. Thank you, Alan. Could you maybe stand up and show everyone who you are? Yeah. Thank you, everyone. A round of applause, please, for Alan. Thank you. We also have Charmaine Chi, Country Director for the Forest Stewardship Council of Malaysia, FSC Malaysia. Thank you, Charmaine. We've got Jeffrey Sito, the CEO of New Forests. Thank you. We've got a second Jeffrey, Datuk Haji Jeffrey, CEO of Malaysian Forest Fund. Thank you. And I think with that, without further ado, I welcome Alan to deliver, I think, the first sort of perspective today. Thank you, Alan.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude for the opportunity to be doing this sharing this afternoon. So thank you to JC3 committee, as well as the organizers and all the people working behind the scene. Yeah, I'm very honored to be part of the very distinguished panelists, as Pat mentioned. Maybe I start with a fun fact because this is after lunch. So you notice that if you notice, and I can't help but notice that WWF is described as the World Wildlife Fund, but actually we had a new name for some time already. So we are actually now the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So that is a fun fact. You can ask your friend when you go home, do you know what WWF stands for? And it's actually Worldwide Fund for Nature. Yeah, because we have transitioned from a wildlife focus to embrace more aspects of conservation, which is why I'm part of the Sustainable Markets Program. And under my portfolio, I'm the responsible forestry manager. So my day-to-day job involves engaging with the forest certification scheme owners. So the two major ones in Malaysia is FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, as well as Malaysian Timber Certification Scheme, MTCS. So we always engage to see where we can collaborate so that we can have continuous improvement in the forest management as well as the supply chain of our forestry industry. Okay, so I'm someone who likes to simplify, so I think sustainable forestry is a buzzword as well, and I'm glad to see that all of you are interested in this topic. But a little bit of storytelling. So forestry is not something new, right? So, but why we call it sustainable forestry is because it's a distinction between, let's say, traditional forestry, where in the past, the focus has been extraction of timber for profit. So sustainable forestry is really what you have been hearing throughout this conference in terms of not just about compliance, but actually the benefit, strategic planning for maximizing economic, social, ecological, biodiversity benefits. And today you hear about the importance of inclusive finance. So same thing here, inclusive forestry. So there are many, many concepts that are attached to sustainable forestry. Yeah. But a little bit of a very broad, very crash course, I think in the 90s saw the rise of forest management certification, and WWF is part of the movement. So we helped found the FSC, Forest Stewardship Council. So that was seen as a breakthrough because there is now a market instrument that can provide incentive to reward those who are progressive and actually adopt sustainable forest management practices. And so certification is an important tool, and WWF has been advocating for it and promoting it. And to package it in a broader solution, we have also developed programs such as in the past, you might have heard of the Global Forest Trade Network, GFTN, where we actually focus on the big forestry companies, helping them to move towards certification, also looking into their supply chain, making that every chain is certified. And also we had a program called New Generation Plantation, where we also set a standard for what we think a progressive plantation should be. Tree plantation in this context, timber plantation. So some of the principles are including maintaining ecological integrity, making sure that we protect high conservation value in those forests. So high conservation value is another concept, which there are 6 of them, including species, landscape level, ecosystem services, also social, cultural as well. And over time, we have evolved. So actually, I forgot to put in, these programs have evolved and come under what we call the Forest Forward program, where now we focus on 3 pillars. So number 1, on the upstream, sustainable forest management. And then downstream, you have the responsible sourcing, supply chain. And lastly, innovation, which is something that I think is the core theme of this event. We need innovation. We need innovation to make many of these theories come to practice. And this decade is the UN Decade for Restoration. So we have been advocating this approach called a living landscape approach, and which I think is an effective framework to communicate what we are doing, which is on the ground. We continue with traditional conservation, making sure that we monitor species and species population within protected forests, but we also advocating for protection of intact forests. But we also know that production of palm oil, rubber, timber, and so on exists in those landscapes. That's why we are also advocating for sustainable production through certification as well as other initiatives such as responsible sourcing, capacity building, and so on. And lastly, the most expensive of all is restoration. So, the saying, prevention is better than cure applies here. So we find that restoration is a challenge, but is necessary because we do have degraded area within areas that are designated for forests or have very valuable conservation value. So next, please. Next slide, please. Oh, this one, sorry. So a little bit, I was asked to give a little bit perspective on how we are doing in terms of ASEAN as well as Malaysia. So I plugged this figure from the FAO, United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. So what they find is that, between 2010 to 2020, the rate of deforestation has decreased. Of course, you can see deforestation is still happening. So the message is clear. There are lessons to be learned, meaning progress have happened. So we need to learn from those lessons. But deforestation is still a threat to climate change as well as biodiversity loss. And I also encourage you to check out a report that was published by WWF. It's called Deforestation Front, where we propose another approach to look at the threat of deforestation. So not just looking at the drivers, but also in terms of the responses. And we come out with some of the hotspots for deforestation, which include the Mekong countries in Southeast Asia, and as well as parts of Borneo. So there's good and bad at this. As I mentioned, to stress again, there are lessons in the effort from the industry, be it timber, palm oil, or even rubber, in terms of how we have managed to reduce the rate of deforestation. But more needs to be done in the three aspects that I mentioned: protect, produce, and restore. And just a few more food for thought that could hopefully stir some discussion as well. So forest governance is not a new concept, and I think we already have global framework around understanding forest governance. And in Malaysia as well, we have some project around forest governance, but I think the discussion is still much needed, and we still need to create more opportunities, more dialogue for what we call non-state actors. So meaning private sector, NGOs, civil society, indigenous peoples, various institutions. And the idea, this word as well, nature-based solutions, is also very common in discussion of sustainability. But let's go back to the basic. Is really using ecosystem services to enhance the values. So ecological, biodiversity, social, and well-being. If you take any one out of this, strictly speaking, it is not truly a nature-based solution, or at least it doesn't meet that high standard. And I think one of the themes that has been going on throughout this conference as well is that we have been doing a lot of effort, doing well in terms of pointing to the dangers of the dual crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss, not to mention social inequality, social injustices, and so on. So now we need to move forward. So now what? What's next? What can we do about it? As we were discussing before this, for example, solutions such as carbon has been developing for some time. And we see that many parties are still being very careful. So that is very important because we want to make sure there's safeguard. But at the same time, we need to move with more momentum towards financing the green. So financing credible projects that are nature-based solutions. And also, I think we hear from this morning as well, the need to, so we talk about blended finance, so finance that is profit-driven as well as impact-driven. So I think that we need to do both in terms of starting with small projects that has especially on the social benefits, but at the same time, to make the business case for even broader and long-term impact, we do need the scale. So I think in this area, there needs to be a lot of collaboration, data sharing, and so on.
Alan, you've got 1 minute left. I'm sorry to push, but we got to keep on time.
Thank you. Okay, so lastly is my last slide. In terms of the innovation, there's a lot of innovation in the sphere of sustainable forestry. But I think I would share these three, which I, in some ways or other, have been involved in. So one of the projects that I had opportunity to take part in is called the Voices for Mekong Forest. So this project actually has a multi-country approach and actually bring together stakeholders, including state and non-state actors. So what I think that they have done well is actually providing a lot of room for dialogue and bringing people together, and also help to capacity build the NGOs as well. So what I see from there is that they are applying complex framework, but involving the people on the ground. And to move quickly, New Generation Plantation in Vietnam, which I had a chance to visit, you can see here. One of the message from our leader is that people underestimate how difficult it is to balance the profit, the benefit to nature as well as communities. That is why there's great value in actually helping establish and enhancing these so-called micro and small community enterprises that provide solutions towards climate change and biodiversity. Lastly, the Sabah Landscape Program is something that we are proud of. We think that we have advanced the dialogue and provide a framework so that we have a holistic view of landscape conservation, protect, produce, and restore. And so, again, my last message is, I think all of us, I think we are vested in changing the status quo. We have had progress, but we want to do better. So back to the cliche thing, we need to find the common ground and the middle ground, which is more difficult done than say. What's the last one? Restoration projects. Yes, so restoration is a huge challenge. We need capital, we need financing, which is why I think we have the right audience. So I'll end here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alan. World Wildlife Fund for Nature. I think. Thank you for that correction. Though I believe in the US, they still retain the World Wildlife Fund. Interesting fact, in the 90s when WWF, the panda, took on WWF, the wrestling, the panda won. So that's why WWF wrestling is now WWE. So just another fun fact there for you. Thank you, Ellen, for keeping on time. Just to remind everybody that the Slido question sort of dashboard is alive. We've got lots of questions in already, but we'll spare that to the end to have sort of a much more interesting panel discussions. But lots of questions already about the link between carbon and forests, looking at forestry standards. So lots of interesting questions there already. I welcome the second panelist, Charmaine Chi from FSC Malaysia, country director, to present her 10 minutes. Thank you, Charmaine.
Thank you, Petra. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and many thanks to the organizers. I can speak about FSC for days, okay? But I'm only given a 10-minute slot, so bear with me. If you have any questions, please do post it on Slido, or just reach out to us at any time at all, okay? The Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC, was established in 1994 as an independent non-profit organization with the mission to promote responsible management of the world's forests. And what that means is environmentally appropriate, socially beneficial, and economically viable of the world's forest. Okay, so we drive positive impacts on the ground, no deforestation, no degradation, through what we call FSC policy for conversion. Responsible forest management through our FSC forest management certification, and lastly, restoration and conservation through our FSC remedy framework. Okay, Now, FSC has 10 principles which form the foundation of our forestry standards. Okay, they embody environmental, economic, and social aspects. Now, these 10 principles are actually globally relevant, so there is already 10 principles in place with criteria to meet these principles. But what happens is that we adapt it locally through a very formal process, and that's what we did. In 2019, we actually produced the first FSC National Forest Stewardship Standard of Malaysia in 2019. And last year, we produced a revised version. And one of the key changes is that it now includes the scope of non-timber forest products. For example, rubber latex, bamboo, rattan, even mushrooms and honey. So any of these products, you can certify a forest or forest plantation under a new NFSS of Malaysia. Okay. So FSC provides solutions to protect forests, verifying products from forest to shelf. So at the forest level, we have what is called the FSC Forest Management Certification Standard. So meaning to say any forest or forest plantation that wants to get certified needs to conform with that standard. Okay. And as an extension of that, we have this, which is optional. It's called the Ecosystem Services Verification Procedure. I will elaborate on that later on. As for supply chain, companies within the supply chain, we have what we call the FSC Chain of Custody Certification Standards. So this standard is for manufacturers, producers, processors, traders, brokers, any company in the supply chain that wants to make changes to FSC certified materials. Okay, so what this means is that at any time, if you see a product with an FSC label, it means that the entire chain of companies have actually gone through FSC certification, right from the forest to the end producer. Otherwise, the product cannot actually carry the FSC label, so the chain can't be broken. Okay. And then lastly, we have what is called the FSC promotional license, and this is for retailers. So companies who are not certificate holders, but they either they either sell or they use FSC certified products. Okay, for example, if you walk into Marks and Spencer, you will see their products in boxes. The boxes carry the FSC label. They don't actually manufacture it. They actually get it from an FSC certified supply. But maybe they want to communicate to their customers that, hey, you know, we actually use packaging that is responsibly sourced and that carry the FSC label. So for them to use the trademark, they actually have to sign a license agreement with us. Okay, so they are called the FSC promotional license holder. And I'm not sure how many of you know who Blackpink is. Hands up, anybody who knows who Blackpink is? Great. Okay. So they are a K-pop girl group. They have about close to 60 million followers on Instagram. So YG Entertainment is their agent, and YG Entertainment is one of our promotional license holders. And that's because all the artists that sign up with YG Entertainment actually use FSC certified paper for their album covers. So Blackpink, Jisoo, who is a member of Blackpink, and Treasure, a boy band group. Hi, Adam. They actually did like a 40-second video for us promoting sustainable forest management and promoting FSC and asking their fans to actually support sustainable forest management, of course supporting FSC as well. So I wanted to give a little bit of time on this ecosystem services verification since we are all talking about carbon and biodiversity here. So this verification procedure is an option for FSC FM certified areas. So this enables forest managers to actually measure and verify the positive impact of the way they are managing their forest responsibly. In 5 ecosystem services, okay? Biodiversity conservation, carbon capture and storage, watershed services, soil preservation and conservation, and lastly, recreational services. So what this means is once any or all of this ecosystem services is verified by the third-party certification body, the forest manager can then use the claim and communicate it either on their platform, any of their communication platforms, it could be their sustainability report, it could be their website, or even their social media platforms. Now, this opportunity is also available to any organizations, whether you're in forestry or not, including financial institutions, to sponsor the responsible management of any forest. Okay, by being a sponsor, you get to use the claim. Okay, so we have many ecosystem services verified projects in the world, but not yet in Malaysia. So there's a lot of opportunities for that, and we do have some examples which I can share with you in another time, I suppose. So how much time do I have? Okay. I just wanted to show you what an FSC certified forest look like. It's a healthy forest. A lot of people have this misconception that timber harvesting or logging equals deforestation. That's not true. Deforestation is really clear cutting, bare bones. There's no more forest. There's no trees left. Okay, but you can harvest timber from a forest and it still looks like a forest. Okay, in this slide, I wanted to show how FSC can be used as a sustainability tool to help companies in various sectors meet their sustainability targets or even, be aligned with global initiatives. So, for example, the IPCC actually talks about how sustainable forest management can generate the largest climate mitigation benefit, and it also is essential to meeting sustainable development goals. On top of that, United Nations actually regard forest certification, actually recognize it as a means to meet some of its targets, especially under SDG 15. In fact, FSC's work actually contributes to 14 out of 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So even in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, FSC is actually referenced in there in meeting target 10.2. Basically the increase in sustainable forest management areas. Spot is an online assessment of commodity producers and processors in timber, pulp and paper and rubber. So FSC is also used as a benchmark to assess these companies in terms of their ESG disclosures. And of course, the very talked about EUDR, the European Union Deforestation Free Regulation, FSC's normative framework is very much aligned with the EUDR. So what that means is that if you're FSC certified, it is very likely that you'll be able to meet many of the due diligence requirements under the EUDR. And even the signatories of Principles for Responsible Banking, Sustainable Forest Management, and in fact some actually have a preference for FSC in terms of their lending policy and their position statement, including Principles for Responsible Investment as well. The signatories, they do reference FSC in their policy statements as well. And FSC is actually exclusively preferred by LEED. LEED is is a green building certification scheme basically. And in fact, many countries have their public procurement that also specify FSC as a preference in terms of meeting their public procurement policies. So I think that's it for now. Our call to action is really to join our mission to protect the world's forests. And why? Because the message is really quite simple. Without healthy and resilient forests, we will lose the fight against climate change and biodiversity loss. Thanks.
Thank you, Charmaine. Round of applause. Now, 21 years ago, FSC actually had Jennifer Lopez front an FSC campaign. It was nothing else is good enough. But that makes me a bit sad because that means it was 21 years ago that I first started working in forestry. But, you know, I think message today is I think a lot of these issues that we're talking about have come in cycles. They're much more urgent today because of disclosure, regulation, and expectation from financial institutions, which I think is a good thing. It's moving us in that direction. And perhaps on that point, I'd like to invite Jeffrey Sito, the CEO of New Forests, to give his 10 minutes. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Charmaine, and you'll be happy to know that all our forests in Asia are fully FSC certified, so we're good to go. Hi, everybody. My name's Jeffrey Sito. I'm the head of emerging markets for New Forests. Many of you probably haven't heard of who we are, but maybe a quick introduction of that. And let me start with the vision of New Forests, and that is to see investment in land use and forestry and all other forms of land use as central to the transition to a sustainable future. And when they talk about land use as about up to a quarter of the solution for climate change, about 12 gigatons, that becomes very, very important as we think about how we use our land. A little bit about us. Which one do I press? So a little bit about New Forests for those who don't know. We were founded in 2005 in Australia by our founder, a gentleman called David Brand. Many of you may know or have interacted with him. He's literally the father of almost forestry and one of the old hands at it. We are a fund manager that invests in nature-based solutions. So we are the second largest nature-based solution, natural capital, forestry and land use investor in the world. And we have about $7 billion under management across all our platforms and strategies. That $7 billion encompasses around 1.2 million hectares of land across Asia Pacific, Africa, United States, and Australia and New Zealand. We have regional investment strategies. So in each of our regions, again, in northern US, northern USA, North America, Africa, Asia Pacific, and New Zealand, we have offices in each of those places. We do believe that co-locating in and amongst our assets, especially for land use areas, is what gives us a comparative advantage vis-a-vis some of our other competitors. And again, our head office is in Australia, where we were started. We have about 120 employees now. And just on the climate change side, in North America, we've issued, and one of the largest issuers of carbon offsets into the ARB 32, which is the Californian cap and trade scheme. We've sold about $300 million of carbon offsets. We were the first institution to issue an ACCU, which is the Australian Carbon Credit Unit, in their compliance scheme in Australia. And we also issue into the New Zealand market with New Zealand units. And you'll see that those are 3 compliance markets that we play in. The rest of our business, or the emerging markets part of our business, is going to be in the voluntary carbon market. So we have that expertise. We're looking to develop projects in and amongst the assets that we invest into. So what is the case and characteristics for investing into forestry and agriculture and land use as an asset class? I've got to get this right. Traditionally, forestry and land use, it's a real asset class, similar to the other types of real asset classes. So you think of infrastructure, real estate, and those things. So where we derive that income from a sustainable tree plantation is through biological growth, by selling the product, but also then replanting in an intensively managed tree plantation. Like other real asset classes, we also have the characteristics of historically low correlation to other traditional asset classes, so it's good in a portfolio, it helps you to diversify. Very steady state growth, so very low volatility of returns. It has inflation hedging characteristics, and of course the positive ESG attributes that forestry and land use brings. There are some new thematics emerging now, and especially in the last few years in the voluntary space, we are starting to talk about carbon offsets, and this is a climate conference. So that is the first iteration of our ability to monetize different parts of our landscape, and I'll talk about landscape investing later. So that contributes. Climate change mitigation, there is a massive carbon credit opportunity. There is an ability to value and drive additional capital into the sector to get basically new trees in the ground, and the ability to contribute to other nature positive outcomes and other things, opportunities that are associated with the circular bioeconomy. When we invest, there are three premises or three ESG things that we look at primarily in all our investments. Is firstly, how does our investment contribute to the circular bioeconomy? So timber as the ultimate renewable resource can substitute for concrete, it can concrete for steel, and there are a whole abundance of things that timber and timber products can be used for. And the idea is one day, hopefully, everything you use that is plastic, for instance, will be a wood or a wood product. The second is how do we contribute to climate change mitigation, but more broadly, nature-based solutions and other positive impact outcomes. And I'll talk about how we do that through some of our funds, but primarily around climate change, biodiversity conservation and preservation, and community and livelihoods on the ground. And the third premise is that how do we provide shared value to all our stakeholders? So when New Forest thinks about shared prosperity, it's the stakeholder on the ground, the community in and amongst our forests, is just as important to us as the pension holder, as your nurse or your teacher that rely on this investment for a pension later on in their life. So some people have just talked about blended finance structures. We've put that into place. And so the genesis of this was we are up to our second fund in Asia. We have a Tropical Asia Forest Fund 1, which was raised in 2012, and now we have just finished TAF 2, which is about a $150 million fund, and that to continue on with the strategy. And that blended finance structure came about where in our original fund, we used certifications, FSC, we also incorporate the IFC performance standards, we have zero deforestation policies, we have FPIC, free, prior and informed consent with the communities, sustainable supply chains, all that underpins our ENS policy. But we thought for the second fund, how do we do more? How do we go from a do no harm approach to a do more good approach? And the whole premise of impact investing is to invest for impact with intentionality. And we've managed to incorporate that into our second fund as a work in progress to say that the generation of impact and the generation of commercial returns are not mutually exclusive. It should be business as usual. And we see TAF 2 as a transition to achieving that goal. So what is blended finance for us? Just roughly, we identify different pools of capital with different specific outcomes that they want to generate, and we put them into this fund. And so we have two classes of shares. One is the impact investors, as we want to call them, that want to have impact outcomes or us to invest into more impact outcomes, but also that crowding in and catalyzation of a much larger commercial pool. And that's how we achieve scale in this industry. And so with that larger commercial pool, one, the impact dollars go a lot further in terms of being able to scale, but also those commercial investors will get a return, a commercial-based return, because we are competing for capital against every other asset class in the world. And what that does is then allows us to invest into, and so we've identified 18 impact outcomes across climate change, biodiversity, and livelihoods and community engagement. And we integrate that at the beginning of each investment that we look into. So we look at where are the opportunities to be able to generate that impact at the beginning as opposed to a bolt-on. And that we find gives you the greatest level of bang for your buck. And what that does also is, for instance, a community forestry project, it reduces risk. It licensed to operate, social license to operate. is the key fundamental of any land use investment in the world, and especially in emerging markets. If you don't have the communities on site, you're going to tell me
I'm going to tell you 1 more minute. Yeah.
1 more minute. But it also has the ability to improve return by generating. Well, when we started this, the carbon signal was about $1 something. So the voluntary carbon markets are now becoming more and more profitable, as well as looking forward to biodiversity outcomes and other things. And the strategy now is an evolving strategy. And so when we look at, and I think this is important, when we talk about investment into forestry, we really mean investment into landscapes. And New Forest, we call ourselves a forestry manager, but we actually are a landscape manager. And so what you have here is a landscape level investment. And within that landscape level investment, you have your traditional underpinned industrial tree plantation. You have your conservation areas, so high conservation value forestry. We also use the high carbon stock approach to our conservation areas. You'll have some industrialization through vertical integration in a tree plantation. You'll have biodiversity areas and riparian boundaries, and that is all encapsulated in a single investment. So the more of that investment that we can use, or the more of that land we can optimize, the more compelling investment into the space becomes. So I'll give you an example. 5 years ago, it was just the industrial tree plantation that had to carry the conservation areas because other land, it was available for other land uses. But what we've been able to do with the conservation areas, you may have a carbon project. With the biodiversity areas now, you may have biodiversity projects that are coming up. The timber processing mill or the mill gives us that vertical integration. It allows us not just to capture more value in the investment, but also in the local economies that lead to employment and capacity building, knowledge transfer. And the more of this landscape we can use, the more we can value that piece of land so that it competes against other land uses, because that is exactly what the ecosystem services, carbon signals, biodiversity signals is meant to do. It's meant to value that land so that this does not get deforested and turned into an oil palm plantation, because there's value in this now. And I think that is how we've evolved from the traditional industrial tree plantation to our now, we call it mixed-use landscapes. I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Big round of applause. And finally, last but not least, there's a second Jeffrey in the room, Datuk Haji Jeffrey, the CEO of Malaysian Forest Fund. Welcome, Datuk. Please present. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon. Thanks, Prep. And thanks to the organizing this variable seminar. Yeah. And of course, MFF was invited to give a little bit thought about sustainable forestry. I think this is actually my career in forestry, because I've been serving forest department 30 years, and what I will be talking about is more on the forestry itself. So top one, is it? Oh, okay. Okay. This slide shows us about the forest as the fundamental for regulating the Earth's climate through storage and exchange of carbon from atmosphere. So we know that forests, there are 5 carbon pools: the above ground living, the dead wood, the litter, soil, and below ground. And forests play a vital role in the global carbon cycle, acting as essential carbon sequestration. In Malaysia, we have 3 forest types. Yeah, that is the mangrove, the peat swamp, and also the inland forest. The carbon content is higher in mangrove compared to the peat swamp and inland forest. Yeah, so among these forests, tropical rainforests stand out as the most significant carbon storehouses, thanks to their vast biomass and high tree density. These forests store substantial amount of carbon in above ground vegetation, such as from the towering trees. as well as the below ground in the form of roots and soil. Mangrove forests and peat swamp forests in Malaysia also plays a vital role in carbon sequestration due to the high organic carbon contained in soil, especially peat, which can store carbon for centuries. So together with these diverse forest types contribute to Malaysia efforts to mitigate the climate change by serving an essential carbon sink to the process of carbon sequestration. So what is actually the carbon sequestration? So carbon sequestration is actually the process of capturing and storing the carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere, primarily through the natural mechanism like photosynthesis in plants and also in subsequent storage of carbon in vegetation and also in soil. So it can also involve human intervened efforts such as afforestation and also reforestation. So the sequestered carbon is then quantified and verified, leading to the generation of carbon credits, which then represent a reduction in greenhouse gas emission, denominated as its equivalent to 1 metric ton of CO2. So in general, if that area is a degraded forest, can store between 20 ton carbon dioxide equivalent to and 130 ton carbon equivalent worth of carbon, and intact forest can store more than 300. We have been engaging the states, and we have carried out our carbon assessment, whereby, for example, in Sungai Menyala, we found that we calculated about 252 ton of carbon equivalent, and in PD near the Timah Pasoh, around 250 or so. But in Taman Negara, we calculated about 350 ton carbon dioxide equivalent. So there are various ranges of carbon, depend on the destruction of the forest area. The severe the area are degraded, the lower is the carbon stock inside. So we need a project to enhance the carbon stock, as what we are telling about the RED Plus initiatives. So next slide, I'd like to talk about the issues and also the challenges. So as we know, our forests in Malaysia covers about 54.858%. That record in year 2020, accumulating to around 18 million hectares. And as we know, also Malaysia has committed in Rio Summit by our Prime Minister Tun M to maintain at least 50% forest cover, and to date, under the collaboration and coordination between federal and states government, we have still kept through this commitment. So after 30 years, the percentage is still intact. It's more than 50%. And foresters also have adopted comprehensive approaches to sustain the forests that apply to value beyond specific forest management. This including the resource-dependent communities, the biodiversity, the potential interaction of forest management with climate change. However, there are so many challenges to manage our forests sustainably. If I may give some of them, first is the deforestation, as what the other panelists have been talking before. Secondly, the climate change. And thirdly is the land use conflict. The fourth one, infrastructure development, and resource scarcity, and also the market dynamic, and also the conflict, community and stakeholder engagement.
Datuk, 2-minute warning, yeah.
I'm rushing of time. Okay. A little bit about MFF. This is the instrument that already decided by the cabinet in 2021, and the framework, the RFF, the RED Plus Finance Framework, which introduced the two protocols, that is the FCC, the Forest Conservation Certificate, and also the forest carbon offsets. We have been engaging the states to deliberate these two protocols, and we do hope that the awareness is there, and we are going to be next step where we will engage by projects. Yeah. So next slide. a little bit about potential sites project that we have discussed. That we found that through our engagement, we have found that there are findings about most of the sites are fragmented and small scale. It is about less than 500 hectares for a single area, and each project may affect multiple stakeholders, including the multiple state agencies, which make it complicated and to manage drivers of differentiation and also drivers of degradation. So there is a need for initial financial support prior to reaping the rewards from potential carbon projects. So this project may take longer time and require commitment financial support also. So another 2 points will be most of the project indicate low carbon results and may require consideration under a jurisdictional creating program to be more flexible. And last one, there is a need to long-term commitment which may have implication that the state need to consider before embarking on such project. Of course, the project will be very specific. So that's all for time being, and maybe we can have a special
Q&A.
discussion later on.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dato. May I invite you to please take a seat? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to invite the other panelists as well to take a seat, Alan and Jeffrey. Unfortunately, I think Charmaine has had to leave us. She's got a plane to catch. So, yeah, sorry, could we just not put the Slido on? I think it's a little bit more engaging to have a conversation. Thank you. So, thank you everybody for, I think, your active participation so far on the Slido. We actually had a set of prepared questions just in case there weren't any questions, but obviously I think that's not going to be the case today. But just I think for, so that we can maybe work through some of the questions a bit, could I get the guys in the room to just shut off the screen, because I think it's a little bit distracting. So very good, I think, initial sort of setting the scene that we had earlier. So we had NGO sector, we had FSC representation, as well as a sort of asset manager with regards to new forests, and we had representation, I think, from the Malaysian government. Questions, I think, from the floor have focused, I think, one around expectation for companies and targets, and maybe I will set us going by addressing this question to Jeffrey Sito. So there's a question here about expectation for targets for companies and financial institutions. So could we maybe hear from you on what you believe those expectations are with regards to how that links back to deforestation and keeping things conversion free?
Well, first of all, when you're talking about, is that what? Yeah. When you're talking about any private sector investor into a fund, the first expectation is it has to earn a commercial rate of return. If it doesn't earn a commercial rate of return, then you will lose that capital to other forms of other asset classes. So I think that is the single fundamental principle of investing into sustainable forestry, achieving climate change, and all the rest of it. It has to be profitable for capital to come in at scale. The second part of that is what we're seeing a lot of now in and amongst corporates, for instance, is that the corporate customer is now looking to invest into fund products that generate positive outcomes and return. Not because they probably need the return. So if you think of an Apple, they can make another iPhone and get that return, a much better return. It's because they have net zero aspirations. And so as part of that net zero, they want to invest in the sink. But the sink has other outcomes as well. So when you combine that with additional regulatory, or not so regulatory at the moment, but green financial disclosures, like in the EU, whether you're TNFD, which is nature-based financial disclosures, whether you're consistent with the EU taxonomy, whether it's an SFDR Article 9 funds, and all our funds are Article 9 funds. Corporates are being forced to disclose more and more about their investments and how green they are. Now, that is only a positive thing, and that will also drive additional capital into the sector. And so with the advent of the ability to generate offsets that corporates can then offtake and use as part of their net zero targets, as well as earn a return, as well as financial institutions. So if we were in front of an insurance company the other day, and we said to them, you know, you need to invest in this sector, and this helps with your Scope 3 emissions. And they said, how does that help with our Scope 3 emissions? And what we told them was, forestry and land use is the only negative emission asset class. And so for every $1 million invested, so Nuveen has done this study, in a real asset portfolio, for every $1 million invested, you can decarbonize your Scope 3 emissions for your investment portfolio by having an element of forestry. It's a very rough number, 18%, just to throw it out there. But they used infrastructure and real estate as the other two asset classes. So it has a lot of compelling reasons for corporates and financials to invest into the space.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So I guess the message there is that it's got to be profitable, like in terms of target setting, and I think that's a useful message. I wondered, Dato, if you could maybe comment on this. How perhaps could these targets and parameters be linked, for example, to the NDCs in Malaysia?
You mean the carbon?
Yes.
Okay. Again, we have to come into sustainability forestry. Yeah. So sustainable forestry in Malaysia holds the incredible promise. Yeah. Considering the country rich biodi and extensive forest cover and its role as a global hub. Yeah. So of course this will generate carbon, and of course it also will be contributing the NDC in later on. Yeah.
Thank you, Dato. Sure, Jeffrey.
To make about that. So part of what we do is also advocacy. So you'll see a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia coming up with carbon exchanges, carbon schemes, whether it's a Vera methodology or what have you. We sat in front of the Indonesian government, and their main concern with voluntary carbon markets was that that would take away from their NDCs. And so what we wanted to tell them was that when you have a regulated scheme alongside the voluntary schemes, you should be encouraging the voluntary schemes. Why? Because by definition, because they're voluntary, the off-takers of that do not need that corresponding adjustment. But what the country needs is the investment into the sink. So it's the voluntary schemes that will drive that investment. It does not take away, because they transfer it and use it against their net zero aspirations, it does not take away from their NDCs. They still claim that as their NDC. And that was the most interesting part about the conversation. And it was an aha moment. But if you don't evolve alongside the voluntary markets, you will have no sinks and you will have no NDC in 5 years' time. So you have to do that investment today. And I think that's a very powerful message to all regulators, policymakers out there. Down the track, you may decide to grant corresponding adjustments. That's when you get your surplus. That's because the investments have already been made beforehand. But you don't have that luxury without the investment.
I think just keeping on that point, there have been questions, I think, in the Slido that refer to standards and how sort of carbon standards could be verified better. Questions, I think, that link back to sustainable forestry and previous, I suppose, comments about how that's not well verified into the process. So just on that point about both the voluntary carbon markets as well as national markets, perhaps I think maybe shift over to Alan and see whether or not what the NGO view is on this with regards to how you manage, I think, the quality of the certifications, but also how you verify. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. So it's a big question, and I have to admit that for WWF Malaysia, in terms of the carbon landscape, it's still a learning journey for us. I know it's been a long learning journey, but we have initiative in terms of working with some of the leading consultants in the world in terms of assessing the forest carbon in our country. So we have some mapping done on the carbon stock across the landmass in our country. So we have some overview in terms of we use the high carbon stock approach because we need a framework to actually analyze the biomass. So the high carbon stock approach, for example, is used in RSPO. So we recognize as the gold standard in palm oil certification. So we do find that there are degraded areas within forest reserves, meaning land that are designated for forests. And in terms of carbon project, we do lean on our international network. So we are learning from our international colleagues. There are some guidelines internally, and I would say that we are still learning, and we need to collaborate internally as well as externally, including with our sustainable finance. But just one message that I got from the panel this morning is that we are still working hard. We are still working hard to make sure that there's a collaborative approach, because as one of the speakers say that there is evidence that high credible carbon credit may work. But of course, we are careful as an NGO in this journey.
Maybe to reframe that a little bit, I think, because there's some questions here about how you keep some of the forest areas as conversion-free, etc. But I think in light of, you talked about the gold standard, I'm not sure you're referring to the gold standard specifically, but in the voluntary market, we also have VCS, the Vera standard. And we also know that in Malaysia, we're moving towards setting up a sort of national carbon standard, for example. So perhaps the comment here is, and I think we could move to Jeffrey and Dato as well, but Alan, maybe a quick comment on, do you see relevance in previous work around ensuring quality of forest certification standards versus what's going on in the space of the voluntary carbon standards?
Yeah, so just to correct my mistake before, what I mentioned was our RSPO is considered the more stringent standard. I used the word gold standard.
For palm oil though, for palm oil, yes.
Which caused the confusion. So to clarify, your question is about whether all the work within the certification space, whether from our perspective it translates into the carbon verification. Is that the question?
So I think it was more around the lessons with forest certification and how you feel that translates, or your view, WWF's view, in how that translates to the creation of, say, the Malaysian carbon standard. Any lessons to share, but
Yeah, I think for certification, people have high expectations as well, because there is a lot of effort put into certifying FMU, Forest Management Unit. I think the recent thought leadership is that in the scheme of things, certification is really not a silver bullet, so it's part of the solution. And we are also hearing that the carbon project proponents also adopting this perspective. I think that the carbon projects is an important part of the bigger solution. And so I think that in terms of the lessons learned, definitely in terms of the best practices, in terms of third-party verification, the importance of biodiversity and social values needs to be translated over.
Thank you. Dato', I wonder if you could comment on that.
Okay, thank you, Pep. When we talk about sustainable forestry certification and the credibility in the market, I would like to deliver some points here. Firstly, the credible forest certification should encompasses of comprehensive management standards. Yeah, it must go beyond just assessing logging practices and also take into account the broader social and economic well-being of workers and also local communities. So transparency also and inclusiveness in decision making should also be integral component in these standards. So secondly, maybe on the rigorous control mechanism to gain the trust. Again, forest certification scheme should incorporate a robust verification system and a rigorous control mechanism. And the other point I would say is the stakeholder involvement also. So certification can only ensure responsible forest management if it involves a wide array of stakeholders. Yeah, and also another point is regarding about scientifically sound regulation and also the legislation. Last but not least, independent party certification itself. Yeah, thank you so much.
Jeffrey, maybe we could address that question in terms of how you perhaps avoid risk in how you operate when you're looking at the various certification schemes.
Again, I do think that, you know, like when you're talking about FSC, it's not just a certification, it's how you manage a landscape. It's not about how you log it, it's not about this, it's a comprehensive management of the landscape. And if you're thinking about managing landscapes, that is incredibly important. So take a step back just from carbon. You have management of biodiversity, you have free, prior and informed consent. And so you're managing all these aspects of a landscape, and that in itself is a massively de-risking measure. So, you know, you have a risk-adjusted return. If you reduce the risk, that's just as good as increasing the return. That's the first aspect of it. So then, because of that certification, that underpins then the carbon project. Because with carbon, especially under VERA, you have CCB. And that includes biodiversity, that includes community. In future, you'll have a biodiversity standard. But that all starts from the underpinning certification. And what it does is it gives you a consistent framework and methodology. I don't think the voluntary carbon markets are there yet, but certainly when you're thinking about FSC or the other PEFC certification standards, they are more consistent when you're talking about land use.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I think we do need to wrap up, but just to sort of highlight, I think there were some questions here that relate, I think, to specific to FSC. Charmaine's not here, so I think maybe we can't quite address those. Questions around inclusiveness of Orang Asli, indigenous peoples. And I think just to reiterate, so Jeffrey sort of addressed that as well. I think the expectation is there. If you're looking, I think, at expectation for nature disclosure, the TNFD does also incorporate that element. So in addition to what climate disclosure is asking for within the TCFD, TNFD in particular holds those requirements there. So I think we are sort of coming through a point where what we're saying is, with regards to sustainable forest management, it's very much linked to the climate agenda. And in Malaysia, I think we've seen movement from the government on basically how we're pulling together the national standards for that, working with the states around that landscape management. So I think maybe to finish off, one last question. And this is, again, I think, with regards to benchmarking. I'll maybe reframe the question, maybe to each of the panelists here. In terms of where you see Malaysia right now, I think
is there press in the room?
Well, yeah. Well, we've got some media, I think, you're observing, but you know, perhaps maybe if I could get each of you to voice where you believe Malaysia is currently at in terms of what we're doing, I think, on both climate and nature. Dato, maybe to round us off.
Quite tough question. As a Malaysian, we believe that we keep on pushing so that our nature base is still intact. As I mentioned just now, we kept our forest 54.85% after so long. After 30 years, we still have that number also. So with that, I think carbon project is a bonus, is an additional effort to maintain the forest as an heritage to our next generation. So I would say that at the moment, and we are working hard on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dato. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I mean, from a forestry perspective, Malaysia used to be one of the largest providers of wood to the world out of Sabah and Sarawak. but unfortunately that meant deforestation of natural ecosystems. I think the government has a role to play in some replanting, and certainly there are replanting obligations, but more enforcement around that. In terms of when you're thinking about the carbon regulatory regime, what's heartening is that notwithstanding that each of the countries in Asia are going it alone, establishing their own registries, through and trading or having registration in the country itself, they're all sort of coming to the same conclusion. And whether that's by collusion or because it's just the right thing to do, you'll see everybody moving towards that. I think Malaysia's a little bit further ahead than most because you've got Bursa, you've got a local carbon registry, you're even incorporate, and ultimately we're going to have to incorporate the Vera methodologies because nobody's going to invent them by themselves, certain tweaking. But what I will say, and Indonesia now has just said, we're not going to register under Vera, it's SRN, goes through the Jakarta Stock Exchange. Again, the point is you've got to allow, if you want to attract international investment into the space, either a dual registration or a shadow registration with the Vera registry. Because corporates overseas, they don't recognize the local registries. They only recognize for want of it's not perfect Vera, but it's an international standard that they can, that is well understood, and they can use that. And so you don't lose anything by allowing a shadow registry, but you do gain by then bringing in, again, investment into those sinks, into your countries.
And to finish off, Alan, what do you think?
I think I'm encouraged by what our minister have said, that with our government now pushing the vision of Malaysia Madani, that sustainability is at the core, and I think we can see a lot of conferences, dialogues, and events around sustainability. And I think, people who have involved in forestry, we know that forest issues are complex. Some people describe deforestation as a wicked problem. So I guess take encouragement in some of the actions that our government have taken, and congratulate the government as well in terms of very concrete actions such as increasing the amount of the ecological fiscal transfer. And I think that moving forward, there must be room for constructive criticism. There must be room for dialogue, but at the same time, there is an urgent need for collaboration. So somehow we need to strike a balance where, finger pointing needs to be, collaboration needs to be the way forward, and we need to also find ways to, put down some of the baggage that we might have had in some of the worst times in terms of, environmental damage. So I think moving forward, the key is collaboration, and all the organizations that our panelists represent are organizations that WWF wants to work with, and we look forward for further collaboration. Yep.
Thank you. So to sum that up, quietly confident, I think, in Malaysia, some way to go, maybe a bit more consultation, a little bit more positioning, I think, around what we want to do around a voluntary carbon market versus the national markets. And with that, please put your hands together for our remaining 3 panelists. Thank you so much for staying, and thank you for your time. Thank you.